Let's get started. Story number 1.
The evening air was heavy with the scent of rain, though not a drop had fallen. Jenna adjusted the strap of her camera bag as she stepped onto the cracked wooden porch of the old Bellinger house. She had driven 4 hours from the city to this sleepy little town, lured by tales of a haunted home where a family of 5 had disappeared in the winter of 1956, never to be seen again. The house had since gained a reputation for unexplained noises, shadowy figures, and a suffocating sense of dread. It was the perfect setting for her blog series, Dark Corners, where she explored legends and ghost stories across the country. The Bellinger house, however, would prove to be her most ambitious feature yet. The house was dilapidated but still standing strong against time. Peeling paint revealed weathered wood underneath, and the windows were like black eyes staring into her soul. Jenna's hands trembled as she unlocked the creaking front door with the key she'd obtained from the local historical society. The air inside was stagnant, as if it hadn't moved in decades. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs stretched like eerie lace across the ceiling beams. The main hallway branched into a living room on one side and a kitchen on the other. At the far end of the hall was a staircase leading to the second floor, where the children's bedrooms were said to be. Jenna set up her equipment in the living room first. She turned on her voice recorder, placed an EMF detector on the coffee table, and began snapping pictures. Shadows danced on the walls as her flashlight beam cut through the darkness. She spoke aloud, as was her practice during investigations. "If there's anyone here, you're not alone. My name is Jenna. I don't mean any harm. I just want to hear your story." Her voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The EMF detector remained still, its lights dim. Jenna waited, her ears straining for even the faintest sound. An hour passed with no activity, so she decided to move upstairs. The staircase groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with every step. The second floor was worse than the first, with peeling wallpaper and a pervasive smell of damp wood. She entered what was once the children's bedroom, where 2 small beds with rusted frames sat side by side. A scattering of toys lay forgotten on the floor. Wooden blocks, a headless doll, and a tiny, rusted music box. She crouched and wound the music box carefully. The tune was haunting, almost sorrowful, as it filled the room with its thin, trembling notes. Her camera flashed as she took a picture of the music box, but as the flash faded, she saw something, or thought she did. A shadow taller than her loomed near the doorway. Her breath caught, and she swung her flashlight toward the spot. Nothing. She shook her head, laughing nervously. "Getting jumpy, Jenna," she muttered. Her heart was pounding. The voice recorder crackled. She froze, staring at the small device she'd placed on the windowsill. It was faint, but unmistakable. A voice, distorted and whispery, saying something she couldn't quite make out. She played it back immediately. "Get out." Jenna's skin prickled as the words sank in. She was no stranger to unsettling evidence. But this was different. It felt personal, as though the house itself was addressing her. "Why should I leave?" she asked aloud, trying to sound braver than she felt. Silence. She spent the next hour combing through the upstairs rooms, but the oppressive atmosphere only grew heavier. At one point, she thought she heard the faint sound of children giggling, but it faded as soon as she tried to locate it. It wasn't until she descended back to the first floor that things truly took a turn. As she entered the kitchen, the EMF detector on the counter lit up suddenly, its green and yellow lights flickering wildly. She grabbed her camera, snapping a photo. The flash revealed nothing unusual, but as soon as she lowered the camera, she heard it. A sharp, echoing knock on the wall behind her. Her breath caught. Slowly she turned, flashlight aimed at the spot. The knock came again, louder this time. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice trembling. A third knock, more deliberate and closer, followed. She felt a chill spread down her spine, and then, faintly, she heard it. The music box melody, though she had left it upstairs. She spun around, her flashlight beam bouncing erratically. "Who's playing the music?" No response, just the eerie tune echoing through the house. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Jenna backed toward the front door, her instincts screaming at her to leave. As she fumbled with the lock, her flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed her, and in that instant she felt it. A presence, cold and heavy, looming just behind her. She turned, and for a split second she saw it. A figure, pale and translucent, its hollow eyes staring into hers. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, in a blink, it was gone. Jenna threw the door open and stumbled outside, gasping for air. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, soaking her as she sat on the porch, trembling. She couldn't bring herself to go back inside to retrieve her equipment. The next morning, she returned with a local guide, but the EMF detector, voice recorder, and even her camera were gone. It was as if the house had swallowed them whole. Jenna never wrote about the Bellinger house. She deleted every picture, every recording, and never spoke of the experience again. But sometimes when she closed her eyes at night, she could still hear the faint, sorrowful melody of the music box. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The sun had just set, leaving the sky a bruised mixture of orange and violet, when Alex pulled his car into the overgrown driveway of the old Hadley farmhouse. It was a dare, a stupid, childish dare from his friends. Spend one night in the house everyone in town claimed was haunted, and they'd cover his gas for a month. Alex didn't believe in ghosts. He was a skeptic through and through, the kind of person who rolled his eyes at ghost hunting shows and snickered at horror movies. But something about the Hadley house unsettled even him. Maybe it was the way it seemed to crouch among the trees like a predator, its windows dark and uninviting. Or maybe it was the stories, tales of strange noises, sightings of shadowy figures, and the chilling account of the Hadley family's disappearance 50 years ago. He grabbed his backpack from the passenger seat, stuffing it with snacks, a flashlight, and his phone, and stepped out of the car. The air was still too still, and the distant chirping of crickets seemed muted. The house loomed ahead, its paint peeling and shutters hanging at odd angles. A single gnarled oak tree stood in the front yard, its branches skeletal against the twilight sky. As he approached the front door, he noticed the faint smell of mildew and something else, something metallic like rust. The door was unlocked, as he'd been told it would be. It creaked loudly on its hinges as he pushed it open, and he stepped inside, wrinkling his nose at the musty air. The interior was even worse than he'd imagined. Dust coated every surface, and the faded wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips. Furniture was scattered haphazardly, as if someone had left in a hurry. The living room to his left held a sagging couch and a toppled lamp, while the kitchen to his right was filled with rusted appliances and broken dishes. He set up camp in the living room, laying out his sleeping bag on the least dusty part of the floor. As he pulled out his phone to check for service, none, of course, he noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, a weight pressing down on him. "Okay," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. "One night. Easy." He wandered through the house, exploring. The staircase leading to the second floor was warped and creaked under his weight, but it held. Upstairs, he found 2 bedrooms, one with a rusted metal bed frame and a closet door that hung ajar, the other filled with broken toys and a dollhouse that had seen better days. In the hallway, a small door caught his attention. It was set low in the wall, almost hidden behind the tattered remains of a curtain. He knelt and opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The basement. Every fiber of his being told him not to go down there, but curiosity won out. He pulled out his flashlight and descended, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the metallic smell intensified. The basement was a cavernous space filled with old furniture, crates, and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, and on it sat an object that made Alex's stomach churn, a dusty porcelain doll, its glassy eyes staring straight at him. He hated dolls, always had. Something about their lifeless faces unsettled him. But as he stared at this one, he swore its head tilted ever so slightly to the side. "Oh," he said aloud, backing up the stairs. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, at first. He settled into his sleeping bag, eating a granola bar and scrolling through old photos on his phone to pass the time. Around midnight, the first noise came, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles on wood. He froze, his heart pounding. "Just the house settling," he whispered to himself, though he didn't believe it. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the kitchen. Slowly, he stood and crept toward the doorway, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello?" he he called, his voice shaking. The tapping stopped. Silence filled the house once more, thicker and heavier than before. He turned back toward the living room, and that's when he saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, standing at the base of the stairs. It wasn't moving. It didn't have to. Just the sight of it made his blood run cold. He shone his flashlight on it, but the beam seemed to pass right through as if it wasn't really there. "Who's there?" he demanded, though his voice cracked. The shadow tilted its head, mimicking the porcelain doll, and then it was gone. Just gone. Alex didn't sleep after that. He sat in his sleeping bag, flashlight clutched in his hand, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. The hours dragged by, each one more nerve-wracking than the last. At 3 a.m., the smell hit him, a sickly sweet odor, like rotting meat. He gagged, covering his nose with his shirt, and that's when he heard it. Faint, high-pitched laughter. Children. He bolted upright, spinning around to locate the source. The laughter echoed from all around him, disembodied and otherworldly. "Stop it!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty house. The laughter stopped, and then the basement door slammed shut. Alex's heart nearly stopped. He hadn't closed that door. It had been open since he'd come upstairs. His flashlight beam trembled as he aimed it at the door. He wanted to leave, to run out of the house and never look back. But the dare kept him rooted in place. His pride wouldn't let him leave early. Another knock, this time on the front door. It was slow, deliberate, and loud enough to make him jump. He approached cautiously, every nerve in his body screaming at him to turn back. He peered through the dirty window beside the door, but there was no one there. The knock came again, even louder. He threw the door open, shining his flashlight out onto the porch. Nothing. Then, from behind him, a whisper. "You shouldn't have come." He spun around, but no one was there. The whisper had sounded so close, as if someone had been breathing the words directly into his ear. That was it. Pride be damned. He was leaving. He grabbed his backpack and bolted for the door, not caring if he left his sleeping bag or snacks behind. As he reached the threshold, the oppressive silence was shattered by a deafening crash. He turned just in time to see the dollhouse from upstairs, tumbling down the staircase, its tiny furniture scattering across the floor. And standing at the top of the stairs was the shadow. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. Alex didn't wait to see what would happen next. He ran out the door, jumped into his car, and didn't look back until he was miles away. For weeks afterward, he tried to rationalize what he'd experienced. Maybe he'd been overtired, or maybe his friends had rigged the house to scare him, but deep down, he knew the truth. The Hadley house didn't want visitors. It wanted victims. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It started with a phone call. Sophie was halfway through folding a basket of laundry when her cell phone buzzed on the counter. The number wasn't one she recognized, but something compelled her to answer it. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end for a long moment. Then a voice, soft, cracked, and distant. "Sophie, it's me." She frowned. "Who is this?" "It's Maria." Sophie froze. Maria was her sister who had died 6 months ago in a car accident. She hadn't been able to shake the grief since that day, the unbearable guilt that came from missing a call from Maria the night she died. "This isn't funny," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "Who is this really?" The line crackled, and the voice came again. "Sophie, I need your help." The line went dead. Sophie stared at the phone, her heart pounding. It had to be some kind of sick joke, she told herself. Someone had to have spoofed Maria's number. But deep down, a cold knot formed in her stomach, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, as Sophie lay in bed, the phone call replayed over and over in her mind. She hadn't told anyone about it, not even her husband, Jack. He'd think she was crazy, or worse, he'd try to rationalize it in a way that would only make her doubt her own instincts. At 2:13 a.m., Sophie woke to the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. She sat up, her heart racing, but the hallway was empty. Jack was snoring softly beside her, undisturbed. "Hello?" she whispered into the darkness. There was no answer, but the air in the room felt different, heavier, colder. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, intending to turn on the flashlight. As soon as she unlocked the screen, she saw it, a missed call from Maria's number. Her breath caught. The call had come in at exactly 2:13 a.m. For the rest of the night, she sat awake in bed, clutching the phone and staring at the dark hallway. She didn't sleep a minute. The next day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. Shadows seemed longer than they should have been, and every time she glanced at the corner of her vision, she thought she saw movement. At one point, as she stood at the sink washing dishes, she swore she heard Maria's voice again, faint and distant, calling her name. By the third day, Sophie was desperate for answers. She pulled out the old cardboard box she kept at the back of her closet, Maria's things. It was a small collection of items she couldn't bring herself to part with. A scarf, a journal, and a few photographs. At the bottom of the box was Maria's phone, cracked and no longer functioning. She stared at it, her fingers trembling. It didn't make sense. Maria's phone was destroyed in the crash, so how could someone be calling her from that number? As night fell, Sophie decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed closure, even if it meant confronting her own fears. She grabbed her car keys and drove to their old family home on the outskirts of town. The house had been empty since their parents passed, but she and Maria had spent countless summers there as kids. If Maria's spirit was reaching out, Sophie reasoned, maybe it was connected to that house. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the house itself loomed in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes. Sophie stepped out of the car, clutching a flashlight, and made her way to the front door. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The floors creaked beneath her feet as she walked through the familiar rooms, memories flooding back with every step. She stopped in the living room where an old rocking chair still sat by the window. It had been Maria's favorite spot to sit and read. Sophie hesitated, then whispered, "Maria, are you here?" The house seemed to hold its breath. Then, faintly, she heard it, the sound of the rocking chair creaking. Her flashlight beam landed on the chair, which was now swaying gently back and forth, though no one was in it. Tears filled her eyes. "Maria, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't answer your call that night." The chair stopped moving. For a moment, Sophie thought she'd imagined the whole thing. But then she felt it, a light, cold touch on her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, and her heart nearly stopped. Another call from Maria's number. With trembling hands, she answered. "Maria?" This time, the voice was clearer, though still faint. "Sophie, you have to go. It's not safe." "What? What's not safe?" Before she could get an answer, the line went dead. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the house. Sophie's blood turned to ice. She turned toward the sound, her flashlight shaking in her hand. At the end of the hallway, a shadow moved, too large, too unnatural to be human. It moved closer, its form twisting and shifting, and the growl grew louder, more menacing. Sophie backed away, her heart pounding. She stumbled out the front door and ran to her car, fumbling with the keys as the shadow seemed to follow her, spilling out of the house like smoke. She didn't look back as she started the car and sped away, tears streaming down her face. When she got home, she locked every door and window, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the keys. Jack woke up, startled by the noise, but she couldn't bring herself to explain what had happened. For weeks after, Sophie refused to answer her phone whenever Maria's number appeared. The calls came less frequently over time, and eventually they stopped altogether. But every so often, when she was alone at night, Sophie swore she could still feel that cold touch on her shoulder.
Story number 4.
It was late autumn, and the nights were beginning to grow longer, colder, and eerily quiet. Erin had just moved into the old house on Chestnut Hill, a 2-story Victorian relic she'd found for an unbelievably low price. The realtor had mentioned something vague about its reputation, but Erin was too focused on starting fresh to pay attention. After her divorce, she needed space, solitude, and a project to keep her mind occupied, and this house seemed perfect. The house stood at the edge of a thick forest, its windows staring blankly toward the road. Its faded blue paint was peeling, and the shutters hung crookedly, but Erin saw potential. She spent her first week scrubbing floors, patching walls, and unpacking her life into its creaky old frame. It was on the second night, as she lay in bed with the wind howling outside, that she first heard the sound. It started faintly, almost indistinguishable from the creaks of the house settling. a slow, deliberate tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. At first, she thought it from a tree branch brushing against a window. She ignored it, pulling the blankets tighter around herself, but the tapping continued, steady and insistent. Finally, she got up, flashlight in hand, and checked the windows. The trees outside were still. The tapping stopped. Just an old house, she muttered to herself, climbing back into bed. The next morning, she shrugged it off as her imagination. The house was old, after all. Maybe the wind had rattled something loose, she reasoned. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't been entirely alone that night. By the end of her first week, Erin started to notice other oddities. She'd leave a room and come back to find things moved. A chair slightly out of place, a cabinet door ajar, her keys on the kitchen counter when she was sure she'd left them by the door. She tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to her own forgetfulness, but the unease grew. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Erin was in the living room unpacking a box of books when she noticed a photograph tucked behind a loose floorboard. The picture was old, black and white, and slightly warped. It showed a family, a stern-looking man, a woman with dark, piercing eyes, and a little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit. There was something unsettling about the girl. Her expression wasn't the carefree innocence Erin expected from a child. Instead, she looked frightened, her wide eyes staring directly at the camera. Erin turned the photo over, finding a single word scrawled on the back in faded ink. Stay. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to shake it off. It was probably just something the previous owners had left behind, she thought, tucking the photo back under the floorboard and focusing on her unpacking. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. It echoed through the house, relentless and precise. Erin sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. Hello? She called, her voice shaky. The tapping stopped, and then from the corner of the room she heard it, a faint, childlike giggle. Her blood turned to ice. She aimed the flashlight toward the corner, but it illuminated only shadows and the peeling wallpaper. She didn't sleep that night, every creak and groan of the house making her jump. The next morning, she decided to do some research. Sitting at her laptop in the local cafe, she searched for any information she could find about the house. What she discovered made her skin crawl. The house had belonged to the Greaves family in the early 1900s. The parents, Thomas and Clara, were rumored to be strict, almost cruel, particularly toward their young daughter, Margaret. One night, according to old newspaper clippings, Margaret had gone missing. The townspeople searched the woods and surrounding areas for weeks, but she was never found. The house was eventually abandoned, and over the decades, strange stories began to circulate. Visitors reported hearing laughter, footsteps, and faint whispers. Some claimed to see the figure of a little girl in the windows, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Erin's hands shook as she closed her laptop. She told herself it was just local legend, the kind of story small towns clung to. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. That evening, Erin decided to confront whatever was happening in the house. She couldn't keep living in fear. Armed with a flashlight and a firm resolve, she began exploring every inch of the house, starting with the attic. The attic was dusty and cluttered with old furniture, trunks, and boxes. As she moved through the space, her flashlight beam caught something in the corner, a small, threadbare stuffed rabbit. Her breath caught. The rabbit looked exactly like the one in the photograph. She reached out to pick it up, and as her fingers brushed the fabric, a sudden chill enveloped the room. The air grew heavy, and a faint whisper filled her ears, so soft she could barely make out the words. Stay. Don't leave me. Erin dropped the rabbit, stumbling back. She fled the attic, slamming the door behind her. That night, the activity in the house intensified. The tapping turned into banging, loud and insistent. Shadows danced along the walls, and faint whispers seemed to come from every corner. At one point, as Erin sat curled on the couch, clutching her phone and praying for morning, the lights flickered. When they came back on, she saw her, the little girl from the photograph, standing at the foot of the stairs, clutching the stuffed rabbit. The girl's eyes were wide and empty, her expression a mix of fear and sadness. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Margaret? Erin whispered, her voice trembling. The girl nodded, her grip tightening on the rabbit. What? What do you want? Margaret pointed toward the floor, her finger directed at the loose floorboard where Aaron had found the photograph. Aaron hesitated, then slowly moved to the spot. She pried up the board, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a locket, tarnished with age. She opened it to find a picture of Margaret and her parents. As soon as Aaron touched the locket, the room grew deathly quiet. Margaret was gone, but the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The house was still after that. The tapping stopped, and the whispers faded. Aaron kept the locket, placing it on the mantel as a silent tribute to the little girl who had been lost and forgotten for so long. In time, the house began to feel like a home, but every so often late at night, Aaron would catch a glimpse of a shadow at the edge of her vision or hear the faint echo of a giggle in the distance. She liked to think it was Margaret, finally at peace but still watching over her. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the kind of place you only heard about in hushed tones. A house at the edge of Old Route 27, shrouded by a dense wall of pines. Locals called it the Grayson House, though no one seemed to remember why. What they did remember, however, were the stories. Whispers of flickering lights at odd hours, faint screams heard by passing motorists, and the peculiar sense of dread that seemed to seep from its cracked foundation. Lila had always been skeptical of ghost stories. She considered herself practical, logical, a realist. When her aunt passed and left her the Grayson house in her will, Lila didn't hesitate to pack up her life in the city and move in. To her, it was just an old house that needed some fixing up. She didn't believe in ghosts. At least, not then. The first few days were uneventful. The house smelled like dust and mildew. The wooden floorboards groaned underfoot, and every so often, the pipes let out an ominous rattle. Lila spent her time cleaning, unpacking, and making mental notes of repairs. The electricity was unreliable, so she kept a flashlight nearby at all times. She told herself the house just needed some love. Nothing more. But it started small. On the fourth night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that paused right outside her door. "Hello," she called out, her voice wavering. No response. She got up, grabbed the flashlight, and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The old wood smelled faintly of rot, and the air was colder than it should have been. She swept the flashlight's beam back and forth, but there was no one there. Just the house settling, she muttered to herself, closing the door and locking it this time. The next morning, as she made her coffee, she noticed something odd. A photo on the fireplace mantel, a faded, sepia-toned portrait of a man and a woman dressed in early 20th century clothing, had been moved. She was sure it had been sitting upright the night before, but now it lay face down, almost as if someone had pushed it. "Maybe I knocked it over while cleaning," she reasoned, though doubt lingered in her mind. By the end of the week, Lila had started to hear voices. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. It seemed to happen most often when she was alone in the living room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, almost angry. One night, as she sat on the couch flipping through an old repair manual, the voices grew louder. "Get out," one of them whispered, so close to her ear that she dropped the book in shock. Lila froze, her heart hammering. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. By now, Lila was beginning to feel like she was losing her mind. She considered leaving, but where would she go? This was her house now, her chance at a new life. She couldn't just give up. It wasn't until the 10th night that she saw it. She had just gone to bed when a sound jolted her awake, wood splintering, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the floor downstairs. She grabbed her flashlight and crept down the staircase, her breath visible in the frigid air. The living room was empty, but the front door was wide open. "Hello?" she called, stepping cautiously outside. The moonlight cast long, jagged shadows across the porch, and that's when she saw her. At the edge of the yard, standing just beyond the tree line, was a woman. She wore a long, tattered dress that clung to her thin frame, and her hair hung in tangled, dark strands. But it was her eyes that froze Lila in place, wide, unblinking, and hollow. "Who are you?" Lila managed to choke out. The woman raised one hand, slowly pointing back toward the house. Her mouth moved as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, the woman vanished, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. Lila slammed the door shut and bolted it. She didn't sleep that night. The next day, determined to get answers, she drove into town and stopped by the local library. She spent hours poring over old newspapers, searching for any mention of the Grayson house. What she found made her stomach turn. In 1923, the house had been owned by a couple, Henry and Beatrice Grayson. According to the records, Henry had been a volatile man, prone to violent outbursts. One fateful night, he had flown into a rage and killed Beatrice, dragging her body into the woods behind the house and burying her in a shallow grave. Henry disappeared soon after, and the house had changed hands numerous times over the years, with each new owner reporting strange occurrences. Some claimed to see a woman wandering the property, while others reported hearing whispers and footsteps in the night. Lila's hands shook as she read the accounts. The woman she had seen matched the descriptions perfectly. That night, she decided to confront whatever was haunting her. Armed with a shovel and a lantern, she ventured into the woods. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she felt compelled to go. The air was heavy and still, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. She wandered for what felt like hours, the lantern casting eerie shadows around her. Just as she was about to give up, she saw it, a patch of earth that looked disturbed, the soil loose and uneven. Her heart raced as she began to dig. The shovel hit something solid after only a few feet, and Lila's stomach churned as she unearthed what appeared to be fragments of old, decayed wood. A coffin. She didn't want to open it, but something told her she had to. She pried the lid loose, revealing a skeletal figure in tattered fabric, the remains of Beatrice Grayson. As Lila stared at the broken, fragile bones, a sudden gust of wind extinguished her lantern, plunging her into darkness. And then she felt it, a cold, bony hand on her shoulder. She screamed, dropping the shovel and stumbling backward. When she turned around, there was no one there, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if someone or something was watching her. "Beatrice," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I'll help you. I'll make this right." The next morning, Lila contacted the authorities, reporting what she had found. The remains were exhumed and given a proper burial in the town cemetery. After that, the house grew quiet. The whispers stopped, and the oppressive weight lifted. Lila stayed determined to reclaim the space as her own, but every so often as she walked through the woods or sat by the fireplace, she felt a presence, a quiet, watchful figure, always just out of sight. She liked to think it was Beatrice, finally at peace but not entirely gone. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The road to my grandmother's house was long and winding, bordered by dense woods on either side. As a child, I loved visiting her, running through the open fields and helping her bake bread in her small, sunlit kitchen. But as I got older, I visited less and less, busy with school, work, and eventually a life of my own in the city. It wasn't until she passed away last year that I returned to the house, now empty and left to me and her will. I hadn't stepped inside for years, but I still remembered every creak of the floorboards and the faint smell of lavender she always kept in sachets around the house. When I first arrived, I was struck by how unchanged it all seemed. The mismatched furniture was still in place, the old clock in the hallway still ticked faintly, and her favorite rocking chair sat by the window as if she'd only just left it. I decided to spend a week there, sorting through her belongings and deciding what to do with the house. It felt strange being there alone, the silence amplified by the surrounding woods. The first few nights were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle, like the sensation of someone standing just behind you, disappearing the moment you turned around. I chalked it up to nerves. The house was old, and I was alone in a place that once held so many memories. On the fourth night, something changed. I was lying in bed, reading a book when I heard it, the faint sound of humming. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a breeze carrying the sound of a distant neighbor's radio. But as I listened, I realized it was coming from inside the house. It was soft, melodic, and oddly familiar. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The humming stopped. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept out into the hallway. The house was silent, the shadows long and still. I checked every room, but there was no one there. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe I'd been half asleep, dreaming without realizing it. But the unease lingered. That evening, as I was sorting through boxes in the attic, I found something I hadn't seen in years, my grandmother's music box. It was a small, ornate thing with delicate carvings along the sides. I remembered how she used to wind it up for me as a child, the soft melody filling the room as the tiny ballerina spun in slow, graceful circles. I wound it up out of curiosity, and the same tune began to play, the same melody I had heard the night before. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I forced myself to laugh. "It's just a coincidence," I muttered, setting the music box aside. That night, the humming returned. It was louder this time, echoing through the house. I stayed in bed, clutching the covers tightly around me, too afraid to move. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next day, I decided to call my mom. She had grown up in the house and might have some insight into what was happening. "Do you remember anything strange about this place?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice casual. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "Your grandmother always said the house had a presence. Nothing malicious, but something old. She used to talk about hearing things, humming, footsteps, whispers. She said it was just the house's way of reminding us it was alive." "Did you ever hear anything?" "No," she admitted, "but I always believed her. She loved that house, though, said it watched over us, kept us safe." That wasn't exactly reassuring, but it made me feel a little less alone. That night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. If it was my grandmother's spirit or something else, I needed to know. The humming started again around midnight. This time, I didn't stay in bed. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the sound. It led me downstairs, through the kitchen, and into the living room. The air grew colder with every step, and my breath fogged in front of me. The humming stopped as I entered the room, and I froze. The rocking chair by the window was moving, creaking softly as it swayed back and forth. "Grandma?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The chair stopped. I stepped closer, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. There, on the seat of the chair, was the music box. I hadn't brought it downstairs. I reached out and touched it, half expecting something to happen, but the room remained still. I opened the lid, and the ballerina began to spin, the familiar melody filling the air. And then I heard her voice. "It's good to see you again." I spun around, but the room was empty. "Grandma," I whispered again, my heart pounding. The voice came again, softer this time, but unmistakably hers. "I've missed you." Tears filled my eyes, and I sank to the floor. "I've missed you too," I said, my voice breaking. For a moment, the room felt warm, as if I were wrapped in a comforting embrace. And then the presence faded, the air returning to its usual chill. After that night, the humming stopped. The house felt lighter, less oppressive, as if something had been resolved. I stayed for the rest of the week, and when I finally left, I took the music box with me. It sits on my dresser now, a reminder of my grandmother and of the strange, beautiful bond we shared, even after she was gone. Story the end.